Dawn crept slowly across the shattered coastline of a small Pacific island, turning the night's smoke into a pale gray mist. The surf rolled in with a steady, indifferent rhythm, washing over spent cartridges, splintered wood, and the silent forms left behind after the previous evening's clash. The air still carried the metallic scent of gunfire mixed with the salt of the sea. From a ridge of volcanic stone, a group of Japanese officers watched through battered field glasses, expecting to see U.S. sailors combing the beach for equipment or preparing new defenses. Instead, they saw a line of Americans kneeling beside the bodies of Japanese soldiers. No laughter, no mocking gestures, only slow, deliberate movements. Two sailors lifted a fallen Japanese infantryman with the same care they would give one of their own. Another marked a shallow grave with a simple wooden stake. The officers watching had been taught that Americans saw them as less than human, yet the scene unfolding below contradicted everything they believed. And as the first shovelfuls of earth fell gently over their dead, a question formed in their minds, one that would unravel far more than the battlefield around them. To understand why a simple burial could stun experienced Japanese officers, the story must return to the wider Pacific in late 1942 and early 1943, a period defined by shifting momentum, growing attrition, and the slow unraveling of early Japanese battlefield confidence. The Pacific War had begun with rapid expansion, the fall of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Japan's forces stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, establishing garrisons on small islands that had rarely seen foreign footprints before. But the victories of early 1942 carried a hidden cost. Supply lines grew fragile. Experienced naval aviators lost at Coral Sea and Midway were nearly irreplaceable. And as American industrial might surged into motion, the Pacific became a battleground of endurance rather than speed. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was regaining its footing after the shock of Pearl Harbor, learning, sometimes painfully, how to fight a long, grinding island war. Across the ocean, Japanese officers lived within a system shaped by Bushido, imperial indoctrination, and a belief that surrender was dishonorable. Death in battle was often seen as the purest outcome. Because of this, Japanese doctrine rarely accounted for large numbers of their own dead lying on open ground after engagements. Soldiers were trained to fight to the last man, not to anticipate organized battlefield recovery. Many officers believed their men would prefer to be left where they fell rather than be handled by enemy troops. The U.S. Navy viewed death differently. Influenced by Christian traditions and formal naval codes, American forces were expected to bury the dead, friend or foe, when circumstances allowed. War Department instructions emphasized preventing disease, maintaining discipline, and upholding a sense of humanity amid violence. Although battlefield burials were not always possible in major operations, they occurred regularly during smaller skirmishes on remote islands, where recovery teams had time to work before preparing for the next advance. Japanese officers, shaped by propaganda and years of cultural conditioning, believed Americans disrespected the enemy dead. Homefront publications portrayed U.S. troops as ruthless materialists who cared nothing for honor. The Imperial Japanese Army reinforced this worldview. Thus, when these officers later observed U.S. sailors performing a respectful burial, the act directly challenged what they had been told for years. By late 1942, many islands across the Solomon and Gilbert chains had become arenas of sudden clashes. Patrol landings, coastal skirmishes, and nighttime engagements often left small numbers of fallen soldiers scattered along beaches. After such fights, U.S. naval detachments sometimes recovered both American and Japanese bodies before the tropical climate accelerated decay. These were not ceremonial burials, often just shallow graves with improvised markers, but they were methodical, quiet, and carried out with a sense of duty. For Japanese officers who had survived earlier victories in Southeast Asia, the shift in American behavior was already surprising. Early war encounters often involved larger operations, leaving little time or space for such gestures. Yet on smaller islands, where U.S. landing parties worked methodically in the aftermath of short engagements, the burial of enemy dead was a practical necessity carried out with unexpected care. The Pacific environment added another layer of complexity. The heat, insects, and humidity made immediate burial essential. Disease could spread rapidly. The U.S. military understood this well, lessons carried forward from the Philippines, Guam, and pre-war tropical deployments. Practicality and respect intertwined into a single act: bury the dead quickly, and do it properly. Meanwhile, Japanese officers observing from concealed positions faced a contradictory reality. Their training taught them that Americans feared death, clung to comfort, and would never risk their lives to perform what Japan considered an honorable duty. Yet there were the U.S. sailors, moving slowly, carefully, in silence, treating Japanese remains with the same solemnity they gave their own fallen. This dissonance created a psychological crack. The officers watching were not only witnessing a burial, they were witnessing a direct challenge to wartime narrative. If Americans respected the dead, what else had Japanese propaganda exaggerated or misunderstood? How many assumptions about the enemy were built on illusion rather than truth? The answers to those questions would unfold slowly, shaped by the brutal months still ahead. But at that moment, on that shoreline, the groundwork for a deeper shift had already begun. And to understand that shift fully, the broader environment surrounding the event needs to be explored with greater detail. The island where this incident unfolded was one of dozens scattered across the Pacific. Small, rugged, and strategically insignificant on a map but vital in shaping control of sea routes. Many such islands were little more than coral ridges or volcanic spines rising out of the ocean, covered in dense foliage and surrounded by reefs that made landings unpredictable. For both navies, these places served as observation posts, refueling points, and early warning stations during the long struggle for maritime advantage. The engagement preceding the burial was typical of the Pacific's smaller clashes. A U.S. Navy landing detachment, often a mix of sailors, Marines, and naval construction personnel, had come ashore to clear the beach after reports of enemy activity. The Japanese defenders were few, perhaps a scattered patrol or remnants of an earlier garrison forced to withdraw inland. In these isolated locations, battles were brief but violent, often fought at close range in the jungle shadows or along narrow strips of sand where there was nowhere to hide. When the fighting ended, the Americans secured the shoreline while Japanese survivors retreated toward higher ground. Among those withdrawing were several junior officers who, bruised and exhausted, carried with them the instinct drilled into every imperial serviceman: observe, evaluate, survive long enough to report what they had learned. The dense terrain hid them well. From their new vantage point, they could see the aftermath unfolding on the beach below. To them, the sight was unusual. In earlier campaigns, particularly during the rapid offensives across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces rarely remained still long enough to witness how Western militaries treated enemy casualties. On large battlefields, bodies were often left where they fell until victory was secured or until burial teams could work safely. Many officers had seen the results days later, but few had ever watched the process itself. Now, with the U.S. Navy establishing a small perimeter, the sailors began clearing debris left from the fight. They worked under a brightening sun, moving with steady coordination shaped by naval discipline. In many photographs and accounts from the period, sailors are shown performing tasks far beyond the stereotypical duties associated with naval warfare: shore parties repairing boats, constructing makeshift shelters, and treating the wounded with limited supplies. Burial was another such task, assigned out of necessity, not ceremony. The Japanese officers knew the importance of the dead within their own cultural framework. Tradition emphasized returning remains to the homeland when possible, though the brutal conditions of the Pacific War often made this impossible. Fallen soldiers were frequently left where they died, their graves unmarked, their families receiving only a wooden death tablet months later. The idea that Americans, whom wartime propaganda portrayed as spiritually empty, would take time to bury enemy dead was nearly unthinkable. Yet the Americans did. After clearing the immediate combat zone, a small group of sailors began moving the bodies of the Japanese soldiers to a more elevated area where the ground was firm. They followed procedures passed down through naval manuals: bury quickly to prevent disease, create shallow graves when deeper ones were impractical, and mark the site for later identification by specialized war grave units. These steps were designed for efficiency, but they carried an unintended symbolic weight. From their concealed ridge, the Japanese officers could see these movements clearly. Every action contradicted their expectations. They saw no signs of contempt, only a kind of quiet focus. The sailors moved without haste, aware of the delicate work required. Some paused to adjust a fallen soldier's equipment or straighten a uniform before burial. These gestures, simple and practical, appeared to the observers as acts of respect. The psychological impact was immediate. Whether they wished to admit it or not, the officers were experiencing a moment that challenged the rigid wartime stereotypes upheld by both governments. Japanese military ideology centered on the belief that enemies lacked honor, discipline, and spiritual depth. American behavior on that beach undermined those assumptions in a single morning. What happened there also reflected a broader reality documented in many Pacific encounters. Despite the ferocity of the war, there were moments, small, unplanned, and often unnoticed, when soldiers and sailors on both sides treated the dead with dignity. In some cases, Japanese units left offerings near American remains. In others, U.S. Marines buried Japanese fallen after fierce nighttime fights. These acts rarely appeared in official reports, overshadowed by larger operations and the overall brutality of the conflict. The burial on this island was one such moment, a brief act of humanity framed by a war that offered few. But to fully understand its significance, the event must be examined from multiple perspectives: human, cultural, tactical, and psychological. And it is from these angles that the deeper meaning of this morning will now unfold. War often forces ordinary men to carry responsibilities they never expected. 4 U.S. sailors in the Pacific, burial duty was one of them. These were not infantry veterans hardened by months in the jungle. Many were engine mechanics, radio men, cooks, medical assistants, essential personnel who happened to be the closest available hands during small coastal operations. Their involvement in battlefield burials emerged from necessity rather than design. On remote islands, specialized grave registration units were rarely present, especially during the early phases of the campaign. Sailors had to adapt. Naval discipline, with its emphasis on order and procedure, carried over naturally. Tasks were completed methodically: secure the shoreline, assist wounded Americans, recover any vital documents, and then bury the dead, regardless of their uniform. This approach reflected a cultural principle deeply embedded in American military tradition. Respect for the fallen, even enemy combatants, was codified not only in regulations but in moral expectation. Many sailors grew up hearing stories from World War I veterans who described burying German soldiers in France. To them, performing a burial was not an act of sympathy but an extension of military professionalism. Yet even with this sense of duty, the work was emotionally heavy. Sailors often spoke about the quietness of such moments, the sudden contrast between the chaos of combat and the stillness afterward. For many, handling the body of a former enemy brought a sobering realization. Both sides were young men sent far from home, their fates decided by decisions far above them. Even without openly stated reflection, this human awareness shaped their movements, giving rise to the careful, deliberate gestures observed by the Japanese officers on the ridge. It was within this human element, calm, solemn, and honest, that the Japanese observers first sensed something they had not expected, a glimpse of shared humanity across enemy lines. For the officers watching from concealment, every detail carried meaning. They interpreted what they saw through a lifetime shaped by tradition, schooling, and military indoctrination. From childhood, many had been taught that Westerners lacked spiritual refinement. During military training, those teachings intensified. Propaganda emphasized that Americans feared death, avoided hardship, and cared little for notions of honor. This worldview had already been shaken by the realities of 1942 and 1943. Americans had proven themselves capable fighters, resilient under pressure, and relentless in counterattacks. Yet certain beliefs held firm, particularly regarding battlefield morality and respect for the fallen. Japanese soldiers believed that dying for the emperor was an act of purity, and that an honorable death required little from the living. Recovery of remains was valued when possible, but the relentless pace of the Pacific War left many dead unburied. The idea that Americans would voluntarily bury Japanese soldiers seemed contradictory to everything these officers had been told. Thus, when they observed U.S. sailors handle each body with measured care, their shock was not simply emotional, it was ideological. The scene contradicted propaganda that portrayed Americans as crude and indifferent. Instead, the officers witnessed an unexpected form of discipline, perhaps even respect. For men who had spent their entire military careers reinforcing a rigid image of the enemy, this moment forced a rare pause. Some officers later noted in post-war reflections that encounters like these were the first time they questioned wartime portrayals of Americans. Such moments did not erase enmity or alter strategic thinking, but they introduced complexity into an otherwise absolute perception of the conflict. And in the layered reality of war, even a single unexpected gesture could shift the internal balance between belief and observation. Beyond cultural and emotional significance, the burial carried clear tactical reasoning. The U.S. Navy understood the environmental dangers of the Pacific. Heat, insects, and humidity accelerated decomposition. Unburied bodies, regardless of nationality, posed health risks that could quickly undermine naval detachments working ashore. Disease control was a priority in every landing directive. Sailors operating on small islands lacked the medical infrastructure found in larger bases. A single outbreak of illness could compromise operations. Thus, burial became a strategic necessity as much as a moral responsibility. Additionally, leaving bodies exposed risked attracting attention from enemy patrols. A beach littered with fallen soldiers might indicate the exact location of recent combat or reveal the size of the American landing force. Burials helped conceal the aftermath and restore operational control. There was also a logistical dimension. Documents, insignia, and personal items were sometimes needed for intelligence evaluation. Once collected, proper burial ensured no further handling was required by additional personnel. Because these procedures were practical and standardized, sailors performed them efficiently. But to outside eyes, especially Japanese officers unfamiliar with American protocols, the efficiency appeared as solemnity, and the lack of mockery appeared as respect. The Japanese observers could not easily separate tactical necessity from moral intent. What they witnessed was shaped by practical strategy, yet interpreted as a human gesture. This duality added depth to the moment and amplified its impact. And now, with the human, cultural, and tactical foundations established, the event itself can be understood from broader perspectives that continue to shape its significance. War in the Pacific was not merely a clash of armies, it was a clash of moral frameworks. Japanese and American forces entered combat carrying different assumptions about honor, death, and the treatment of the fallen. These differences shaped battlefield conduct as deeply as strategy or weaponry. In Japanese military culture, Bushido emphasized self-sacrifice and loyalty unto death. While the idealized form of Bushido was often romanticized, its influence on the Imperial Army and Navy was real. Soldiers were taught that dying honorably required no further validation. A warrior who fell in combat had achieved fulfillment. Whether his body was recovered was secondary. This belief, coupled with the harsh operational tempo, meant that many Japanese dead remained where they fell. American military culture approached death differently. Rooted in a combination of Christian burial traditions, Enlightenment-era respect for the individual, and early 20th century military regulations, the U.S. Armed Forces viewed the handling of remains as an essential duty. Even in improvised circumstances, American units attempted to bury bodies with minimal respect, partly to uphold discipline, partly to prevent disease, and partly to preserve a sense of humanity in the midst of violence. When these two worldviews met on the shoreline of a remote Pacific island, the resulting scene carried a moral weight neither side fully anticipated. The Japanese officers watching from concealment saw Americans performing an action they themselves associated with reverence, not necessity. Conversely, the Americans performing the burial were simply following procedure, unaware of the cultural resonance their actions carried. This collision of codes created a moment in which each side revealed something fundamental about its values, without any of them speaking a word. Even in the harsh logic of war, perception plays a decisive role. Small events, especially those contradicting expectations, can influence morale more deeply than formal reports or official messages. The burial witnessed by Japanese officers represented such a moment. For the Japanese observers, the psychological effect stemmed from cognitive dissonance. Propaganda and military teaching had reinforced the belief that Americans lacked discipline and honor. Yet the sailors on the beach behaved with restraint and care. This contradiction sowed a subtle but significant internal conflict. While it did not diminish their commitment to war, it softened the notion of the enemy as fundamentally dishonorable. Such shifts were not uncommon. Throughout the Pacific War, soldiers on both sides occasionally encountered acts of mercy or professionalism that challenged preconceived ideas. These rare moments did not alter strategic realities, but they created a more complex emotional landscape, reminding participants that war was fought by human beings, not caricatures. On the American side, the psychological impact was different but equally meaningful. Handling the bodies of enemy soldiers reminded sailors of the human cost of the conflict. Many accounts describe such tasks as grounding experiences, moments when the abstract concept of the enemy briefly gave way to the recognition of shared vulnerability. These reflections sometimes strengthened resolve rather than weakening it. War remained necessary, but its consequences became more tangible. Thus, While the burial was a small event in military terms, its psychological influence extended far beyond the handful of men who witnessed or carried out the act. Moments like this reshaped perceptions that had been hardened by months of combat and indoctrination. The U.S. Navy's actions during the burial reflected a deeper institutional culture built on procedure and accountability. Naval operations required strict organization, crew rosters, watch rotations, supply inventories, maintenance routines. This structured environment naturally extended into how the Navy dealt with death in isolated conditions. The Navy's war instructions outlined that remains, American or enemy, should be handled promptly to maintain order and prevent sanitation issues. Burial teams were often led by petty officers responsible for ensuring procedures were followed. Even in improvised settings, a hierarchy guided who dug, who carried, and who recorded the location of graves. This procedural mindset contrasted sharply with the Japanese system, which placed emotional and symbolic weight on death but lacked standardized battlefield recovery processes in remote operations. Japanese naval units did possess well-defined ceremonial traditions aboard ships, including funerals at sea. However, these customs were difficult to apply during land-based skirmishes, where units were dispersed and often operating with limited coordination. The American emphasis on order produced a visual impression of respect, even when the intention was primarily practical. The slow, synchronized movements of sailors performing burial tasks appeared deliberate and ceremonial to Japanese observers accustomed to different norms. This discrepancy in doctrine made the burial scene more striking. What was routine for one side appeared extraordinary to the other. The morning sun had risen fully over the island, burning away the mist and revealing the aftermath of the previous night's engagement. Small craters pocked the sand, and splintered planks from landing craft littered the shore. The surf rolled in steadily, indifferent to the violence that had occurred hours before. Amid this quiet, a group of U.S. sailors moved with a purpose that was methodical yet calm. From a concealed ridge, Japanese officers watched through field glasses. They saw the men arrange fallen soldiers in orderly lines, checking for identification and personal items. Every motion was precise. Bodies were lifted carefully, adjusted, and lowered into shallow graves. Wooden stakes marked the sites, and small bundles of gear were collected. The entire process took nearly an hour, yet not a word of mockery or disdain passed between the sailors. This was no ceremonial event, but the officers perceived it as such. In the Japanese view, death on the battlefield carried intrinsic honor, but recognition from the enemy was not expected, especially not from Americans, who had been portrayed as ruthless and uncaring. Yet here they were, men in blue uniforms honoring, in their own disciplined way, the dead of an enemy force. Nearby, the survivors of the Japanese patrol remained hidden, observing their comrades' final resting place. Their faces were unreadable, but their minds were racing. They had been trained to expect cruelty, desecration, or indifference from the enemy. Instead, they saw respect executed with methodical efficiency. The cognitive dissonance was profound. For some, the first thoughts were disbelief, for others, reluctant admiration. A narrative constructed over months of propaganda was suddenly destabilized. The practicalities of the task were also evident. Sailors worked in pairs, using shovels and spare equipment to dig the graves. The tropical soil, hot and damp, resisted each scoop. Yet every effort was measured, coordinated, as if efficiency itself carried reverence. Small adjustments ensured each body lay flat, with limbs aligned naturally. Flags, insignia, and personal items were carefully removed or arranged to prevent loss, further emphasizing that even amidst the chaos of war, order was maintained. For the Japanese officers, the scene was layered with contradiction. On one level, the burial was necessary. Disease prevention, sanitation, and tactical security demanded it. On another level, it appeared personal, intentional, and deliberate, qualities they did not associate with American military behavior. The quiet care in handling each body was indistinguishable from respect. Every gesture reinforced the unspoken message. Even in war, certain rules of humanity were preserved. Witnessing this, the officers experienced a subtle shift in understanding. What they saw was not merely the burial of men. It was an assertion of discipline, of moral structure, and of cultural difference. The Americans had demonstrated control over chaos, and in doing so, revealed a form of professionalism that Japanese officers had not anticipated. Their perception of the enemy, previously rigid and oversimplified, was now in question. The sailors, meanwhile, remained focused. None of them sought recognition or acknowledgement from the watching enemy. Their actions were dictated by routine, guided by regulations, and tempered by a sense of human decency. Yet the psychological weight of these simple tasks was significant. For some, it was a moment of reflection on the cost of war, a reminder that every casualty, regardless of uniform, represented a life abruptly ended. As the final shovelfuls of earth covered the last of the bodies, a silence settled over the beach. The surf continued to roll, indifferent to the men buried beneath the sand. The Japanese officers slowly lowered their glasses, processing what they had witnessed. The carefully choreographed act of burial, intended as procedure and necessity, had conveyed a message far larger than its immediate purpose. That even in the Pacific War, there were boundaries of conduct, moments of restraint, and an acknowledgement of shared human dignity. From this ridge, with the island bathed in full daylight, it became clear that war was not defined solely by firepower, aggression, or territorial gain. It was also defined by the choices made in moments of quiet, decisions that could alter perception, challenge assumptions, and leave lasting impressions far beyond the battlefield. This moment on the beach would become a reference point for the officers, a memory of unexpected humanity that contrasted sharply with the ferocity surrounding them. And as the U.S. sailors moved back toward their landing craft, the island returned to its routine rhythms, the surf, the heat, the scattered debris, while a small act of dignity lingered in the minds of those who had observed it. As the burial concluded, the scene on the beach left a lasting impression not only on the Japanese officers but also on the sailors themselves. They began organizing their equipment, checking their maps, and preparing to return to the landing craft. Every movement reflected the disciplined routine of the Navy, yet beneath the surface lay a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of what had just been done. For the Japanese officers observing from the ridge, the act of burying the dead had shifted from being a simple anomaly to a defining moment. Years of training, indoctrination, and battlefield experience had taught them to view Americans as aggressive, materialistic, and indifferent to the rituals of death. Yet the measured, deliberate actions of the sailors revealed a system of values that neither mocked nor devalued life. In that realization lay shock, and for some, the first stirrings of respect. Historical accounts from similar engagements support the significance of such experiences. In post-war interviews, Japanese officers frequently recalled being unsettled by unexpected gestures of decency from their adversaries. Soldiers who survived the battlefields of Guadalcanal or Tarawa described American actions, burial of enemy dead, medical care for prisoners, or restraint during close-quarter engagements, as moments that challenged preconceptions about the enemy's nature. The Pacific War, despite its ferocity, contained numerous instances where humanity persisted in small but meaningful ways. From a tactical perspective, the burial also underscored the adaptability and organizational capacity of the U.S. Navy. Handling casualties in a remote location required coordination, foresight, and attention to detail. Sailors needed to maintain situational awareness, prevent disease, and preserve operational security, all while performing tasks that demanded care and precision. That these actions appeared seamless to outside observers further amplified their psychological impact. The psychological ripple extended to the Japanese soldiers who had survived the skirmish. Witnessing the burial forced them to reassess assumptions about enemy conduct, discipline, and values. While it did not immediately alter strategic thinking or combat behavior, it introduced complexity into their perception of the Americans they faced. In the calculus of morale, these moments of cognitive dissonance could resonate long after the battle, influencing decisions, caution, and interpersonal interactions in subsequent encounters. At the same time, the burial highlighted a broader truth about war, that acts of humanity are often constrained by circumstance rather than inclination. The sailors were motivated by regulation, practicality, and professionalism, yet the result transcended its immediate purpose. To the Japanese observers, what was routine became symbolic. A simple act, digging, placing, covering, assumed weight far beyond its procedural intent. It was a demonstration of control, discipline, and a moral framework unfamiliar to those raised in a contrasting military culture. The remaining Japanese patrol eventually withdrew from the ridge, moving silently through the jungle. The memory of the burial lingered. For officers who had spent their lives in strict adherence to doctrine, the image of American sailors methodically honoring the dead created an internal tension, the recognition that courage and humanity could coexist, even on an enemy battlefield. For the Americans, the burial was over, and they returned to their tasks with quiet professionalism. Yet for both sides, The encounter represented a momentary intersection of opposing values, discipline, culture, and morality intersecting under the tropical sun. It was a subtle turning point, not in the strategic sense, but in the human perception of the enemy. War, for a brief morning, had revealed that respect could transcend uniform, nationality, and ideology. The beach eventually fell silent, marked only by shallow graves, discarded equipment, and the sound of the surf. The Japanese officers departed, carrying with them a nuanced understanding that would inform their view of Americans for the remainder of the conflict. Meanwhile, the U.S. sailors moved back to their landing craft, continuing their mission with the same calm precision as before, unaware of the full psychological impact they had left behind. This turning point, the burial of the fallen observed by enemy officers, encapsulated the central paradox of the Pacific War. Amid brutality, deprivation, and relentless combat, moments of humanity endured. These moments, though small in scale, challenged assumptions, reshaped perceptions, and left enduring impressions that would echo long after the guns fell silent. And with the decisive moment established, the story now moves naturally to the aftermath, exploring the consequences, reflections, and broader historical significance of this encounter. In the hours and days following the burial, the island returned to the measured rhythm of military operations. The surf continued its ceaseless motion, the sun rose and set over sand and scrub, and the small detachment of U.S. sailors resumed their duties, repairing landing craft, clearing debris, and preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Yet beneath the routine lay the enduring imprint of what had occurred that morning. For the Japanese officers who had witnessed the burial, the event left a complex impression. Though brief, the act of dignity disrupted long-held assumptions about the enemy. Reports and post-war testimonies indicate that officers often reflected on these moments privately, recognizing that the Americans' discipline extended beyond combat effectiveness to include structured, humane conduct. The sight of their fallen being handled with care contrasted sharply with the ideological narrative instilled through imperial propaganda, which had painted the enemy as crude, ruthless, and lacking honor. The psychological impact extended to lower-ranking soldiers as well. Those who survived skirmishes and observed American burial practices occasionally noted a tension between fear and reluctant admiration. In diaries and letters preserved from the period, some Japanese soldiers admitted that witnessing such procedures challenged their expectations, generating a mixture of incredulity and uneasy respect. While it did not soften strategic resolve or alter battle tactics, the recognition of an organized, disciplined, and morally consistent enemy added a subtle layer of complexity to daily life on the front. From the American perspective, the act of burying the dead was viewed as a procedural necessity, guided by naval regulations and operational best practices. The War Department emphasized the importance of sanitation, disease prevention, and proper documentation of enemy casualties. Burial teams executed these duties methodically, without fanfare or expectation of acknowledgement. Yet, in hindsight, these routine actions occasionally shaped the perceptions of those who observed them, demonstrating that small, deliberate acts could carry significance far beyond their immediate purpose. The burial also underscored the practical challenges of the Pacific Campaign. Remote islands offered little infrastructure, and landing parties frequently operated under conditions of heat, humidity, and limited resources. Maintaining discipline, performing essential tasks, and mitigating health risks demanded careful planning. Recovering and interring enemy dead was one part of this logistical calculus, ensuring that the beach remained suitable for continued operations while minimizing exposure to disease and environmental hazards. Additionally, the event reflected broader patterns in wartime conduct. Though instances of humane treatment were relatively rare amid the scale of the Pacific War, they were not unique. In various engagements, on islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, U.S. forces occasionally buried enemy dead, offered medical assistance to prisoners, and observed protocols that balanced military necessity with ethical considerations. These actions, documented in naval records and veteran accounts, provide context for understanding the broader significance of what the Japanese officers witnessed on this small island. For the officers, the immediate aftermath was not public. The Japanese military hierarchy did not formally record or acknowledge such moments, and battlefield reports focused instead on operational outcomes: positions held, equipment captured, and casualties sustained. Yet the psychological resonance endured. Observing the burial of their fallen by the enemy introduced a subtle recalibration in their perception of Americans, not as caricatures of cruelty, but as disciplined, capable of measured humanity. This recalibration did not diminish the ferocity of combat that followed on subsequent islands. The Pacific theater remained one of the most brutal in modern military history, defined by amphibious assaults, entrenched defenses, and high casualties. Yet moments like this burial persisted in memory, quietly informing attitudes, caution, and the understanding that even the fiercest adversary could act within a moral framework. As the sun set over the island, casting long shadows over the graves, the small detachment of sailors departed for their next assignment. The Japanese officers, meanwhile, retreated inland, carrying with them a memory that would resurface in later encounters, in post-war reflections, and in oral histories. That morning had demonstrated, in stark terms, that respect and discipline could exist amid warfare, leaving a subtle but enduring imprint on all who observed it. And with this immediate aftermath understood, the broader consequences, on perception, post-war reflection, and historical memory, will now be examined in the second section of Aftermath. In the weeks and months following the burial, the small but meaningful act continued to resonate, particularly within the minds of the Japanese officers who had observed it. While immediate combat operations resumed with their usual intensity, beaches were retaken, patrols sent inland, and strategic objectives pursued, the memory of the Americans' careful attention to the dead remained vivid. For officers trained in rigid doctrine, this quiet display of discipline and humanity contrasted sharply with the narratives of an indifferent or ruthless enemy, forcing a subtle reassessment of what they had been taught to expect. Historical records from post-war interviews confirmed that such observations left a lasting imprint. Some Japanese officers described how, even in subsequent engagements, they harbored an underlying recognition that American forces possessed not only superior material resources but also an organizational culture that allowed them to act with moral consistency. The burial of their fallen comrades became a reference point in their reflections, proof that Americans could combine effectiveness with humanity, a duality that challenged prevailing wartime stereotypes. For the U.S. sailors involved, the impact was less about perception and more about professionalism. Their actions adhered strictly to military regulations: ensure sanitation, prevent disease, maintain operational security, and properly document enemy casualties. Yet in the broader scope of history, these routine procedures produced psychological and cultural consequences far beyond their immediate intent. In later accounts, some veterans recalled that their meticulous handling of enemy remains contributed, in a small way, to the complex human interactions that defined the Pacific Campaign. Even unrecognized by their own superiors at the time, their work became a lasting testament to the disciplined application of moral principles under extreme conditions. The act also influenced larger perceptions of warfare in the Pacific. Encounters like this one, though minor in scale compared with major battles such as Guadalcanal or Leyte Gulf, offered critical evidence that the brutal conflict contained moments of restraint, respect, and ethical conduct. Scholars studying the Pacific theater emphasize that these interactions, between surviving enemy observers and American personnel, provided a rare window into the multifaceted nature of combat. Human behavior in war was not monolithic. Even amid relentless violence, there were small acts that challenged assumptions and informed understanding on both sides. Moreover, these moments played a role in shaping post-war narratives. Japanese accounts of the war often highlighted such unexpected gestures as symbols of shared humanity, illustrating that even bitter adversaries could act with integrity. Likewise, U.S. records noted burial procedures as standard practice, yet the wider historical significance lay in the indirect influence these acts had on enemy perceptions, morale, and eventual reflections. The combination of military discipline and ethical restraint became a subtle but enduring element in the collective memory of the conflict. From a broader perspective, the aftermath of the burial underscores a central paradox of warfare. Acts of compassion or procedural care do not diminish the intensity or brutality of battle, but they leave impressions that endure long after the weapons are silenced. For the Japanese officers who had observed the burial, the event represented a point of cognitive and emotional recalibration, a moment where they recognized competence, respect, and humanity in those they had been trained to despise. For the Americans, it was a reaffirmation of duty, showing that adherence to protocol could coexist with ethical awareness. Ultimately, the island itself returned to its usual rhythms. The tides ebbed and flowed, wind swept across the beaches, and future operations claimed the attention of both sides. Yet the shallow graves, meticulously marked and carefully prepared, remained as a testament to that quiet morning. They symbolized not only the physical cost of conflict, but also the capacity for small acts of dignity to resonate across cultural and ideological boundaries. With the immediate and long-term aftermath fully examined, the narrative now turns to reflection and closure, contemplating what this event reveals about humanity, warfare, and history itself. The morning on that remote Pacific island remains a quiet testament to the complexity of human conflict. Amid the chaos and brutality of war, the deliberate, measured act of U.S. sailors burying their fallen enemies revealed a profound truth. Even in the harshest circumstances, discipline, morality, and respect can coexist with violence. For the Japanese officers who observed the scene, the act challenged assumptions, reshaped perception, and offered a fleeting glimpse into the humanity of an enemy they had been taught to fear and disdain. History often remembers battles in terms of strategy, casualty counts, and territorial gain, but moments like this remind us that the war was also experienced on a deeply human level. The clash of cultural codes, the collision of ideologies, and the psychological impact of small gestures all contributed to a more nuanced understanding of what it meant to fight and survive in the Pacific theater. Here, victory was not measured in miles of sand reclaimed, but in the subtle recognition that moral conduct could persist amidst devastation. These small, silent acts leave a lasting legacy. They speak to the possibility of empathy, even across the lines of conflict. They underscore the responsibility of soldiers to act with professionalism, to uphold human dignity, and to acknowledge that every life lost carries weight, regardless of allegiance. For those who witnessed it, for those who carried it out, and for the generations who study it today, the burial of the fallen on that island became more than a procedural necessity, it became a lesson in shared humanity. In reflecting on this event, it is clear that warfare is not solely defined by destruction, strategy, or national might. It is also defined by choices, by gestures that affirm respect and discipline, and by moments when humanity asserts itself amid chaos. The quiet surf, the shallow graves, and the careful hands of sailors remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the capacity for honor and ethical action endures. This episode, though small in scale, exemplifies the intersection of morality and warfare, leaving an enduring imprint on all who observed it, and offering a timeless reflection on what it means to face the enemy with both courage and conscience.